We are tracing the argument through the letter of 1 Timothy, and we are in chapter 5 of 1 Timothy. We come today to 1 Timothy 5 verses 3 to 16, so a fairly lengthy passage that we need to trace the argument through. Let's go and have a look at the structure of chapters 5 and 6 quickly. Chapters 5 and 6, so this is the entirety of 5 and 6, and we essentially have exhortations to 7 different groups of people, and Paul's teaching Timothy how to teach, lead, pastor them, etc. So for today we are here dealing with a fairly lengthy passage about how Timothy is to respond to the issue of widows who have financial need. The implication is that the church used to have a system for looking after widows with financial needs. If we look at the macro structure of the total passage, it's going to look something like this. I see it as 2 halves where verses 3 to 8 make a set of statements about how Timothy is to handle widows who want to be supported by the church. And then verses 9 to 16 restate those principles and actually develop them a little bit further. We could have called it contraction amplification, but I'll just call it statement and restatement. Now, each half has something of a mirror structure. In each half, there are 3 categories of people about whom Paul gives instructions. And I've labeled this as both and then again the second time both and. So the first group is widows who should be supported by the church. Then he talks about widows who shouldn't be supported by the church, and these 2 groups are mirrored here at the bottom. And then there's a third group, which is if a widow has family that's able to support them, the church shouldn't be burdened with them. And so this is another element in the mix. Notice that in the first half, the verses, we've got 3 and 5, 4 and 6. So the treatment of widows who should be supported and shouldn't be supported is not, he doesn't deal with one and then move to the other. He alternates between the 2 as he lays out the structure. Let's go and have a look at the first group. So this is verses 3 to 8, and it's the first statement of this big idea. We're looking at a both and structure. So he both says the church, yes, should support widows, and no, should not support other widows. And he says that it should not be the church's responsibility wherever possible. So if we start on the first half, you'll notice here we've got honor widows who are truly widows. Not to mean there are widows who are not truly widows, but widows who are truly widows needing the church's support. And then there's a but. So the but gives 2 alternatives. So there's widows who are truly widows and should be supported according to the principles the church follows. But there are also widows who shouldn't be supported. So honor widows who are truly widows. And then he says, but if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their household and to make some return to their parents. So the primary responsibility for looking after widows in need, wherever possible, shouldn't fall on the church. It should fall on the family. But if there are people who have no means of support, they are completely alone, they're truly widows, then yes, the church should support them. Now he gives some description. So the entities, we've actually got 2 entities. We've got real widows and widows who have other means of support. And now he gives some additional explanation about each of these. Both alternatives are present. First, she who is truly a widow is left all alone, has set her hope on God, and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. So this is a portrayal of deep godliness. And then the alternative, the widow who shouldn't be supported, is described here as being self-indulgent and is dead even while she lives. The idea is that the church should be supporting godly widows in genuine need, but should not be burdened with supporting widows who have other means of support or widows who are not genuinely, deeply godly. And at the same time as saying, yes, the church should have a structure for supporting widows in need, There's also another dimension to this. He says, positively command these things as well, so that they may be without reproach. And a key question here is, who's the they? It could be the widows themselves, the ones just spoken about in the preceding context, but I think the they is referring to the church Timothy is pastoring. The church needs to be without reproach. In order for the church to be without reproach, it needs to be very careful about which widows it supports and which widows it doesn't. Negatively stated, this means that if anyone, so we hear about the church, the believing community, and if anyone who is a believer, anyone in the believing community, doesn't provide for their relatives, the implications is widows in need, then they are worse than an unbeliever. So 3 groups of people: widows who are truly widows, widows who are widows but are not in the category that should be supported by the church, and then the general exhortation that the first responsibility for caring for these widows falls upon relatives, not upon the church. If we move to verses 9 to 16, we have the same 3 groups repeated, same 3 ideas repeated. This is 9 and 10, this is 11 to 15, and this is verse 16. And we're going to unpack this one in a little bit more detail, section by section. First, let's look at what Paul says about the widow who should be enrolled. Let a widow be enrolled if. So the if states the condition. If she meets certain conditions, she should be put on the list of widows for whom the church provides support. She must be at least 60 years old. She must be a faithful wife. I think this language of a wife of one husband means a faithful wife. And then she must have a reputation for good works. This is an entity, this entity of good works. What are the good works in question? Well, now Paul identifies the kind of good works. If she has brought up children, shown hospitality, washed the feet of the saints, a language for humble service, cared for the afflicted, etc., then she meets this condition of having a reputation for good works, so a life of service. Next, Paul turns his attention to but, so we're giving the other side, so both support and don't support. Support some widows and don't support others. So, but refuse to enroll younger widows. So there's an age component here, younger than. He mentioned 60 in the previous verse, so that's our yardstick. And the idea is do not enroll younger widows. And now he starts to explain why. This 4 is telling us the ground why he shouldn't enroll younger widows. And there are 2 basic reasons. It's both because sooner or later they want to marry again. And if they're young widows, they are likely to be idlers, going from house to house, gossiping, being busybodies, etc. So Paul's advice, don't enroll younger widows, and the inference that we draw from that instead, so, this is our inference word, so, he wants younger widows rather to remarry, have children, raise families, instead of becoming busybodies. He says better for them just to get on with a normal life, start a new family, etc. And lastly, if we look at this one about wanting to remarry, there's an action, they want to remarry, and there's a result. In doing this, they incur condemnation. Finally, Paul doesn't only talk to Timothy about the 2 groups of widows. Yeah, he gives the same 3rd group. So it's both enroll and support widows, that's a yes, and don't enroll and support other widows, that's a no. And there's a 3rd element to this. If any believing widow has relatives who are widows, any believing woman, has relatives who are widows, let her care for them instead of the church being burdened. So it's both and. Both she must care for them and the church must not care for them. That's the right action. So that, our purpose here, so that the church may care for those who are, the it here is the church, pointing back to over here, so that the church may care for those who are truly widows. So what's going on in this passage? Well, essentially, the church at the time had a system for supporting widows who had no other means of support. And Paul gives Timothy guidelines about how this is to be enforced in the church. Firstly, he says, yes, you should support certain widows. And at the same time, no, you shouldn't support other widows. And then, by the way, if any widow has relatives in the believing community, let them take on the responsibility for looking after their relatives so that the church can focus on the widows who are truly in need.